Hello everyone and welcome to this new episode of Civitas on Air podcast. My name is Kerry Longhurst and I'm a professor at Collegium Civitas, and I've got one of my favourite colleagues here, Dr. Agnieszka Nitza, who is an adjunct professor here in Civitas. She's an expert on China's foreign policy, and a really impressive publications record, a massive amount of teaching experience, and she's someone who I've been working with very closely over the last couple of years. And we're here to talk about China. We're here to talk about various elements of China's foreign policy, and you've given us a really nice and provocative title for your podcast, and it is, "Why can China save us from the climate crisis but cannot save us from the war?" A nice provocative title to go with. And I'm going to begin with the first kind of discussion point for you, if I may. The first one, can you tell us, in your view, what exactly is China's role vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine? I mean, what's going on there?
So China has sought to remain neutral on the conflict. However, what we call neutrality here, most Ukrainian experts label as pro-Russian neutrality. What we know today is that China does not support Moscow military. However, when we discuss China, we never can be 100% sure about its actions. First, because of the lack of transparency surrounding these actions, and second, sometimes because of contradictory data. Even in this context, at the very beginning of the conflict, Washington revealed that, in fact, Moscow asked Beijing for military support. Beijing denied it had happened. While not supporting Moscow military, Beijing provides it with strong diplomatic and rhetorical support. When we talk about the first type of support, we can refer to these famous or infamous votings in the UN to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine when China abstained. When we talk about rhetorical support, we can observe that Chinese media parrot Russian propaganda, or at least in the West, we call it propaganda. Yet, interestingly, in that context, on the 30th of April, Xinhua, that is a China news agency, provided with Answers All Right Space, foreign minister of Ukraine, and he used that opportunity to emphasize how damaging Russia's invasion of Ukraine is to China's investment abroad. In particular, he referred naturally to a Belt and Road Initiative, China's mega connectivity project launched in 2013.
Thank you for the answer. I think what is interesting for me, amongst other things, is, as you quite rightly said, that China's approach or lack of tenacity or willingness to condemn Russia's actions, whereas, Beijing would see this as an example of trying to be neutral. Of course, in this kind of conflict, what does neutrality mean? Neutrality means effectively siding with the aggressor, with Russia. But this seems to be totally in line with China's general foreign policy approach in general. This way in which China's standing towards the conflict and this supposed neutrality, etc. In your view, how is this being received by other countries, foreign audiences? What are people and states really thinking about this?
Definitely, Xi Jinping is afraid of reputation losses caused by his pro-Russian neutrality. When we talk about foreign audience reception, I need to mention my favorite concept of soft power and Joseph Nye, and we both do research about that. And recently, Joseph Nye published a paper about China and its standing vis-à-vis the invasion of Ukraine. And interestingly, he claimed that it can be an opportunity for Xi Jinping to act as a mediator. He compared his standing, potential standing, that is not happening now, to what Theodore Roosevelt did back then in 1905 when he pressed Russia and Japan to consensus, and he ended up with a Peace Nobel Prize. And Naya jokes a bit that maybe if Xi Jinping behaves in the way, one day he will get such prize. Yet I would like to emphasize here that these are Joseph Naya's fantasies, not mine. But yet in such a way, China may catch up or may reverse its soft power losses caused by its pro-Russian neutrality, at least from the Western perspective. Here we need to remember that Western perspective is not global perspective. And even these votings in the United Nations, first already mentioned to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, second to suspend Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council, they show us gap between West and, I would say, mostly Asia's rising powers as China, India, Iran, Indonesia.
Yeah, so there's a kind of, to maybe bring it into a nutshell, diverging perspectives on what the global order is, how it should be. And of course, this is really displaying itself, let's say, through Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I want to pick up on some of the points you mentioned there about, you talked about international attractiveness and soft power. And I know, because we've worked together, that soft power is normally attributed to Western countries, Scandinavian countries, the UK, Germany, France, the United States, and that we see it as being to do with democracy and liberalism and freedom. That's, as you mentioned, Joseph Nye's idea of soft power, where it came from and its normative attraction. However, you also mentioned this potentially in connection with China. Well, China's not a liberal state by any stretch of the imagination. It's definitely not a democracy. It's an autocracy. Nevertheless, I know, and you've mentioned, that China has often tried to present itself as a soft power, using different channels. How would you describe China's attempts at being a soft power? What's it doing, and is it being effective?
Well, surprisingly to Naya and his followers, China does not use its political values, that are authoritarian values, if authoritarian values exist, as its soft power resource. Beijing relies on its other attributes. First of all, culture, that it was traditional culture. It was first soft power source emphasized by Chinese academics. Today, we can observe that some traditional values underpin China's foreign policies, as the Peaceful Rise or Belt and Road Initiative. So if you ever looked through any Chinese policy document about these strategies, you can observe that there is a lot about harmonious coexistence or win-win outcome of cooperating with China. It's all linked to China's traditional values. Another key China soft power resource is its economic model, because a lot of states, especially the states of Global South, would like to repeat China's economic success without borrowing from its political values. Today, in our research project, we look at environmental policies, and particularly environmental and climate diplomacy as China's attribute that can make state more attractive.
It's really interesting, and I know that your research in this area is cutting edge and is really trying to dig deep into this concept of soft power with plenty of empirical examples. But just to say, China's soft power, its economic model, of course, it's interesting and exciting for plenty of states because it's been the source of rapid economic growth. But of course, as you mentioned, it doesn't have that softer political ingredient as well, the transformative ingredient that perhaps the European Union or the United States has. And so it makes China particularly attractive to other autocratic countries or despots or parts of the world that don't have accountability to their citizens. But, we could talk about that for a long time, perhaps in different podcasts in the future. Now, I want to go back to the title of this podcast. So, why can China save us from the climate crisis, but cannot save us from the war? Let's talk a little bit about that. What do you mean China can save us from the climate crisis?
Of course, as you mentioned at the very beginning of our podcast, the title is provocative. It does not necessarily true. Personally, I do not believe that China can save us from a climate crisis on its own. Environmental problems have transboundary characteristics, so a single state cannot do it on its own. A multilateral efforts are required. However, China is key here. First of all, because of its huge aggregative size. Secondly, because of the fact that it is the largest greenhouse gases emitter. Also, China took more proactive role in the international environmental regime. We can observe its masterpiece, climate and environmental diplomacy, at the COPs, that are conferences of the parties, the annual high-profile gatherings.
And did that occur, just remind me, did that occur at the time when the United States decided to bomb out of these processes and not be a green leader? Did that help China rise in importance?
Yes, of course. The fact that the US has not ratified a Kyoto Protocol, which China did, helped China as green power. On the one hand. On the other hand, China's audience here are different states than these ones that support the US. China arises as a leader of global South. So it acts in a bloc like G77 plus China or Beijing, where interestingly it shares the same interest as India, its main rival in Asia.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the whole kind of climate crisis and responses and supposed remedies for it really expose this global South versus kind of North and kind of Western liberal democratic countries as well. But does China really practice what it preaches? Because I also know from your work that China might have a strong declaratory presence in climate crisis at an international level and those high level climate related conferences. But at home, China, in terms of pollution in the cities and countryside, is a bit of a mess, isn't it?
Recently, China made headlines by announcing its goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, which applies to its domestic conditions. Many experts in the West claim that China cannot become green because the economic growth has to continue. And they claim that the stability of political regime depends on that. Yet recent wave of world value surveys shows that Chinese population, in fact, care much more about the environment. So Chinese leadership now has to balance it. And for instance, it does it by launching this concept of ecological civilization, which is part of Chinese constitution now. And we can compare it to Chinese way of seeing sustainable development. However, from Western perspective, to a vast extent, it is just a nice label, and different kind of labels appear more often in Western media. On your own, you refer to pollution in Chinese cities. So Western media claim term apocalypse to name what's going on.
I just want to go back to the point you made about the Chinese government having to care about what the Chinese people think. That's quite a bold statement, given what we know about Chinese autocratic methods and lack of accountability to democratic society. Do you mean, therefore, that there are some civil society groups in China with environmental interests? Are they operating now? Are they transnational? Are they reaching out to Western European civil society groups? Is that happening?
That's a really hard question. Probably we will be investigating that for the 2 next years of our project. Some experts, including Western ones, mentioned that some kind of green civil society exists in China. They also emphasize that this type of civil society has more chances to survive in authoritarian China, but no one has ever confirmed, at least to my knowledge, that these kind of groups have an impact what's going on in the state in the context of its green trajectory.
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely one to watch. I mean, I know that from our early research, we've picked up on this idea of civil society groups somehow being quite active in this area. But if and how they relate to government decisions, we need to kind of think a bit more and look at that. Maybe just a kind of direct question. I mean, can we trust China in all of this? It's easy to say, it's harder to do. Is this rising as a supposed green power? Is this just not another way of China trying to revise the international rules of the game whilst remaining totally undemocratic? Is there trust there between states, would you say?
Well, definitely we would like to trust China, because if they fulfill their goals, we will be saved from climate crisis. But if they are not telling the truth, we are doomed. There is a lot of distrust vis-à-vis China because it's authoritarian. Western societies can observe how China treats its own citizens, for instance, during the lockdowns, and it's terrifying because they cannot leave their houses. And then we start thinking, how can we trust this kind of state? Recently, I gave a lesson about China's soft power to high school pupils, and I asked them about their associations with China before I started talking, of course. And most of these associations were negative, and they were linked to human rights violations. So it is really hard to condemn a state looking at some of its policies and then admire it in becoming greener. But maybe we have no choice, given what's going on with our climate.
Yeah, and given how important it is to have those large industrial countries on board rather than, falling off out of international conventions. But it definitely, from what you've been saying today, it brings into focus, when we look at Chinese foreign policy, do we take account of its non-democratic character and just look at external projection, or should we be looking at the two sides together? And I think that's an open question and one that we have to keep considering. Maybe just a final question, coming to the end of this discussion, and going back again to the title about China not engaging, claiming neutrality when it comes to the war. Would you say this is going to have a long-term effect on international appreciation of China as a global actor? And do you think China will change its mind as the war rumbles on? Can we expect a change of perspectives, would you say?
Last week, I participated in a debate in Tartu at the university there about the topic, and the same question was asked. And maybe here I will refer to my colleague from Cambridge who has been investigating China for 40 years. And he claims that that Xi Jinping will not change his mind. It is unlikely that he will act as a mediator here. However, I hope that he is not right. When it comes to China's attractiveness and long-term goals in that particular aspect, well, I think Western perception of China can be changed in a negative way. However, when we talk about Chinese allies that host most of its or numerous investments under the Belt and Road Initiative, as Pakistan and Indonesia, we should not expect these countries to change their minds. Like I've said before, Western perspective is not global perspective, and it is really hard to understand for us. I've got such feeling.
Yeah, I mean, once again, that idea of China being somehow a leader or a mentor of global South players is important to watch. I think in particular as they become greener in their foreign policy, but at the same time remain autocratic, and the West is going to have, I think, problems with that. So I don't think that we can conclude this podcast without mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic. We seem to have overcome that to a certain degree, but it's going to obviously remain a big part of our lives for a very long time. I mean, what does that mean for your work and your understanding of China? I mean, first of all, the closing down of China again, it seems. What does this say, in your view, in your experience, in your research, about the state of China? And perhaps secondly, how is this going to affect your research? I mean, how are you going to find out about what's going on?
It has already affected our research, in fact, and you are experiencing it as well, because we cannot go to China, and we are not the only ones. The same happens to researchers, students from different Western universities. Also, journalists have problems with accessing China. I know that some researchers move from China to Taiwan, but we are not this case, because it will not help us. So China's zero COVID policy has already affected our research, because we cannot go to China, and we are not the only ones. I know that researchers from other Western research centers have similar challenges. Also, journalists, Western ones, are not allowed to enter China. Definitely Beijing wants to tell China's story well in their own words. Maybe we would interrupt them. So definitely COVID and zero COVID policy complicates a lot on the one hand. On the other, it can be another area of my research. So recently I've been thinking about China as a public global goods provider, which is like a buzzword that appears a lot. And I'll try to investigate its health diplomacy, in particular mask and vaccine diplomacy, and identify how it affects its soft power. However, now we've got only short-term perspective that is a bit unfortunate for China.
Yeah, it definitely is, again, another area I think to look at. And of course, not only can we not get in, but the stakeholders inside China relevant to us and interesting to us cannot necessarily get out as well. So I think it does, and it will have considerable implications for the reputational status of China in the world, etc., etc. Agnieszka, it's been really, really nice to talk with you. I've learnt a lot. And I'd like to thank the audience for listening to Civitas on Air and this podcast. Thank you very much again,
Thank you.
Agnieszka. And you can find us, listeners, on various platforms, including Spotify, Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. So thank you very much.